Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment commenced his morning on the Normandy coast like any other day. A faint, humid haze clung to the English Channel, rendering the world in a subdued, gray stillness. The air bore a chill, perfumed with the familiar essence of brine and damp soil. It was just past 5 in the morning. Another shift, another day of taut anticipation. However, through his field glasses, as the earliest glimmer of dawn attempted to breach the horizon, the sea began to transform. It was not the tide, it was not a shift in the weather, it was something utterly extraordinary. A dark demarcation had materialized where the ocean met the sky, a smudge that relentlessly expanded, intensified, and multiplied. This was no mere naval contingent. It was a colossal city of metal, a maritime metropolis emerging from the fog and sailing directly into the annals of history. At that precise juncture, even before a solitary Allied infantryman touched the sands below, before the world even registered the designations Omaha or Utah, he understood that the Reich was on the precipice of being submerged. To fully grasp the profound shock of that morning, one must immerse oneself in the prevailing mindset of Fortress Europe during the spring of 1944. From the northern reaches of Norway down to the southern Spanish frontier, German engineers had erected the formidable Atlantic Wall. Its conception was that of an unbreachable rampart, a continuous expanse of concrete and steel, bristling with artillery, designed to thwart any attempted landing. Within the minds of the German High Command, and within the pervasive propaganda disseminated to the troops, it stood as a testament to the Reich's formidable might. Yet, Oberleutnant Richter, a seasoned military professional and a veteran of the Eastern Front, discerned the disparity between manufactured narratives and tangible reality. At 32 years of age, he was old enough to recall a different Germany and young enough to have been forged in the crucible of war. He was practical, keenly observant, and profoundly weary. His command consisted of an artillery battery equipped with sturdy, well-engineered cannons housed within reinforced concrete emplacements, positioned a few miles inland from the very beaches that the Allies would later codename Omaha. From his elevated observation post, a concrete bunker sunk into a high escarpment, he possessed an unimpeded panorama of the sea. Day after day, he and his soldiers engaged in rigorous drills. They meticulously computed firing trajectories, maintained their weaponry, and fixated upon the vast, empty expanse of gray water. The perpetual topic of conversation revolved around the impending invasion, Dare Tag X, the day of days. But the crucial questions remained. When would it occur? And more significantly, where would it manifest? German intelligence harbored an unwavering conviction that the primary assault would target the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. It represented the most logical strategic choice. It was in this vicinity that the 15th Army, comprising the bulk of Germany's western military strength, stood in readiness. Normandy, conversely, was relegated to the status of a secondary theater, perhaps a site for a diversionary action, but decidedly not the principal objective. This monumental strategic misjudgment was not an anomaly. It was the direct consequence of a masterful Allied deception operation codenamed Operation Fortitude, a stratagem that left the defenders of Normandy perilously exposed. Richter's unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, while superior to many others in the region, was merely a pale shadow of the elite formations that had conquered France 4 years prior. It was a composite force, comprising seasoned veterans from the Eastern Front, like himself, alongside a considerable contingent of very young teenage conscripts and older reservists. They possessed courage and a sense of duty, but they were a far cry from the stormtroopers of 1940. Their mandate was to maintain a defensive line stretched far too thin. The Atlantic Wall itself bore more resemblance to a fragmented mosaic than an unbroken bulwark. Numerous fortifications remained unfinished. Minefields exhibited significant gaps. The sheer immensity of the operational area meant that even a heavily fortified strongpoint could be effectively bypassed and isolated. Richter was acutely aware of these vulnerabilities. He had observed the informal pathways still utilized by local farmers and the blind spots within their fields of fire. He harbored a professional skepticism regarding their prospects against a truly determined offensive. In the weeks preceding June, an palpable tension permeated the atmosphere. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with reinforcing the defenses, had initiated a whirlwind of activity. He ordered the deployment of millions of mines and thousands of menacing, jagged steel obstructions along the beaches, which the soldiers grimly referred to as Rommel's asparagus. Rommel grasped a fundamental truth that seemed to elude the high command in Berlin. If the Allies were not repelled on the beaches within the initial 24 hours, the war in the West would be irretrievably lost. Allied air superiority would decimate any German reinforcements attempting to advance to the coast. The first day, therefore, was the sole day of consequence. However, on June 5th, the meteorological conditions took a decisive turn. A tempest descended, characterized by gale-force winds and turbulent seas. The German Meteorological Office confidently predicted that an invasion would be infeasible for several days to come. This forecast afforded many senior officers a measure of relaxation. It was precisely why Rommel himself was absent from France, having returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. The storm, they believed, would ensure their safety. Thus, as Richter stood his vigil in the pre-dawn chill of June 6th, the prevailing mood was one of routine. Although the storm had abated, the sea remained rough. No one anticipated any significant developments. He was gazing eastward when he first perceived it, a fleeting flicker. He raised his powerful Zeiss binoculars and brought them into sharp focus. His heart, which had been beating with the slow, steady rhythm of a night watch, began to pound violently against his ribs. It was not a mere flicker. It was ships, not a patrol, not a reconnaissance mission, hundreds of them, and behind them an ever-increasing multitude. He swept his binoculars from left to right. Wherever his gaze fell, the scene remained identical. The sea was no longer a body of gray water. It was a solid mass of dark, ominous shapes. A chilling dread crept up his spine, the disquietude of a man confronting a mathematical conundrum he could not possibly resolve. For a considerable duration, Richter found himself incapable of processing the scene. The sheer magnitude of it defied all logical comprehension. German intelligence had estimated that the Allies might be capable of mustering 3,000 vessels for an invasion, a figure that even then would have represented a monumental undertaking. What lay before him was something entirely different. He attempted to count, but it was an exercise in futility. His instinctual reaction was to categorize. He could discern the hulking silhouettes of battleships and cruisers. He observed swarms of smaller, swifter destroyers circling them like predatory wolves. And then there were the others, the seemingly endless, uncountable masses. Landing craft of every conceivable size and design, packed so densely they resembled iron filings drawn by a powerful magnet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and then looked again. The image remained unaltered. It only grew more distinct as the sun commenced its slow ascent. The official figure for the entirety of the operation would later be confirmed at nearly 7,000 vessels, an armada drawn from 8 distinct nations. It stands to this day as the largest amphibious invasion force in recorded history. Yet, to Richter, it was not a statistic. It was a palpable presence that seemed to warp the very horizon. It represented a declaration of industrial might so immense that it rendered everything he had ever understood about warfare utterly obsolete. Germany had erected a wall of concrete. The Allies, in response, had constructed a bridge of steel. He seized the field telephone, his hand slick with perspiration. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4, he reported. "I have visual confirmation of the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end was weary, dismissive. "We have reports of a few vessels, Oberleutnant. A possible raid. Stand by." "No." Richter's voice was strained, urgent. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. It's thousands. The entire sea is covered from horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion." There was a pause, laced with disbelief. Richter could almost envision the man picturing him as a panicked junior officer, spooked by mere shadows. "Oberleutnant," the voice continued, "the sea conditions are not conducive. Our reports indicate your observations are inaccurate." Richter shouted, his voice cracking. "I am witnessing it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look at the sea." He slammed the receiver down in sheer frustration. The scale of the event was simply too immense to be believed. He tried another line to regimental headquarters and reached his commanding officer. "Richter, sir," he began, "the invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships." He knew he was exaggerating, but in that moment it felt like an understatement. The major's voice was laced with skepticism. "Richter, are you certain? The weather?" "The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major, and it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire." This time the sheer urgency of his report penetrated. The chain of command was paralyzed by a profound failure of imagination. Their meticulously crafted plans, their maps, their intelligence assessments, all were being rendered meaningless by the reality unfolding a few miles offshore. While Richter was fixated on the approaching fleet, the high command remained preoccupied with reports of paratroopers inland, mistakenly assuming them to be the primary thrust of the enemy's offensive. No one was looking seaward. Richter did not await their confirmation. He bellowed orders to his men. Roused by the commotion, they peered out from their positions, their faces a mixture of awe and sheer terror. They saw precisely what he saw. The drills were concluded. This was the reality. The heavy ordnance was brought forth from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly vast. The immense barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, elevated slowly, their muzzles pointing towards the unbelievable fleet. Richter stood in his post, binoculars pressed firmly to his eyes. He could observe the landing craft commencing their assembly. He could sense the vibration in the very air, a low hum emanating from thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower drawing breath, and he was about to cast the first stone. The order finally arrived just before 6 in the morning. Engage at will. For Richter, it was a release. The paralysis of disbelief was shattered by the familiar clarity of decisive action. "Fire!" he roared into the telephone. A moment later, the ground shuddered as the first gun discharged, then a second and a third. The shells screamed across the water. Richter tracked their trajectory through his binoculars, a surge of professional pride mingling with his deep-seated dread. He witnessed plumes of water erupt amidst the vast formation. A miss, then another. His men were skilled. They adjusted their aim, firing with a disciplined, rhythmic cadence, and for a fleeting instant they registered their impact. Richter observed a direct hit upon an American destroyer, the USS Corey. A flash of orange light and a puff of black smoke marked the event. While some accounts suggest the vessel may have also struck a mine, from Richter's perspective, his guns had drawn first blood as the ship listed, crippled, and subsequently sank. A cheer erupted from his men. For a few minutes, it felt like a genuine engagement. It felt as though their extensive training had truly mattered. However, the sensation was ephemeral, for after the quarry was struck, the fleet did not disperse. It did not falter. The void in the formation was simply filled. The endless lines of ships continued their inexorable advance. It was an iron tide that could not be stemmed. His guns fired repeatedly, but for every single vessel they might harass, 100 sailed past unmolested. Richter experienced a profound sense of futility wash over him. He felt like a man with a bucket attempting to drain the ocean. He looked beyond the impacts of his own shells and perceived the broader panorama. The Allied battleships, vessels such as the USS Texas, were now reorienting their colossal 14-inch guns towards the shore. Then came the response. It began as a low rumble from across the water. He observed flashes of light emanating from the formidable warships, akin to a silent lightning storm on the distant horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him began to rip apart. The ground started to heave. Geysers of earth erupted from the surrounding fields. The systematic industrial process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had commenced. Where was the German counterattack? Where were the panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the skies and observed nothing but Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports. They held absolute dominion over the air. German military doctrine stipulated armored counterassaults. However, the nearest armored unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was crippled by confusion and the imperative of securing a direct order from Hitler's headquarters. When it eventually mobilized, it did so without any air cover, venturing into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers, and was consequently decimated before it even reached the front lines. It was in that precise moment, with his own guns firing and the sky raining down metal, that Richter understood this was not a battle. It was an extermination. The Allies were not seeking to outmaneuver him. They were intent on obliterating him. This singular personal comprehension of overwhelming force defined the entirety of the Normandy campaign. The narrative of how industrial might ultimately supersede battlefield tactics is complex and profoundly compelling. If you find these in-depth explorations of lesser-known historical perspectives engaging, please consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the like button. This support enables us to continue bringing these vital human stories to light. As the naval bombardment intensified, something within Richter's mind underwent a profound alteration. The tactical part of his consciousness went dormant. It was supplanted by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer perceiving ships and soldiers. He was discerning the underlying system that propelled them. He was envisioning the factories. Through his trembling binoculars, he looked past the warships and saw, in his mind's eye, the assembly lines of Detroit. He pictured factories churning out trucks and engines on a scale that Germany could only dream of. The logistical undertaking of this invasion, the capacity to sustain hundreds of thousands of men on hostile territory, was not a miracle. It was a direct consequence of that prodigious industrial output. He surveyed the sky, densely populated with an unending stream of C-47 transport planes and fighter bombers. On D-Day itself, the Luftwaffe managed approximately 300 sorties across all of France. The Allies, in stark contrast, executed over 14,000. For every single German aircraft aloft, there were more than 40 Allied ones. The disparity was not attributable to a deficit in German courage. It was a testament to the factories. And then there were the tanks. He was well aware of the formidable reputation of the German panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were technologically superior, instilling fear in Allied crews. However, that superiority proved to be a strategic dead end. They were complex, prohibitively expensive, and challenging to manufacture. For every awe-inspiring Tiger tank that rolled off the production line, the Allies were stamping out dozens of simpler, yet devastatingly effective Sherman tanks. Throughout the entirety of 1944, the United States alone would produce in excess of 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly production, conversely, never surpassed 2,000 units. The Allies were not aiming to win tank engagements through superior quality. They intended to prevail by burying the panzers beneath an overwhelming mountain of steel. This was the new reality. This was the industrial calculus of defeat. All discourse concerning willpower and ideological fortitude dissolved in the face of these stark numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined populace could triumph over decadent democracies. Yet here lay the irrefutable proof that ideology could not halt a bomber, and willpower could not sink a battleship. Richter experienced a profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were exemplary soldiers. They were about to perish not due to being outfought, but because they were vastly outnumbered on a scale that defied comprehension. They were participants in a conflict that had already been irrevocably decided. He and his comrades, indeed the entire German army in the West, were akin to a finely crafted sword confronting a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome of this confrontation was never in doubt. He recalled the propaganda posters and the unwavering belief in ultimate victory that permeated their homeland. It was all a fabrication, not merely a political falsehood, but a mathematical one. The German High Command must have been privy to this information. They must have reviewed the production statistics. Nevertheless, they had dispatched him and millions of others to wage a war they could not possibly win. It is hardly surprising that, in the war's final year, the immense psychological strain and the confrontation with this inescapable truth led to an increase in suicides among officers on the front lines. They were not merely contending with soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada. They were engaged in a struggle against the full, unrestrained might of the global industrial complex. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the theoretical gave way to brutal, tangible reality. The naval bombardment reached a deafening crescendo, a continuous rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete of the bunker shuddered, and dust rained down from the ceiling. Through the narrow observation slit, Richter witnessed the initial waves of landing craft reaching the shore. Higgins boats lowered their ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the churning surf. The machine guns mounted in the German pillboxes along Omaha Beach commenced their deadly chatter, tearing into the ranks of the first men to disembark. From his vantage point, Richter could observe the horrific drama unfold, the water transforming into a crimson hue, bodies accumulating in gruesome piles. The German 352nd Infantry Division was exacting a terrible toll. For a brief moment, it appeared as though the defenses were holding firm. The Americans were pinned down. But then the industrial equation reasserted itself with unyielding force. Allied destroyers, witnessing the carnage, executed a maneuver that was both suicidal and profoundly heroic. They steamed directly towards the shoreline, some closing to within a mere 1,000 yards, their hulls scraping against submerged sandbars. They turned their guns upon the German fortifications, providing direct fire support in a decisive action that irrevocably altered the tide on Omaha Beach. Simultaneously, a host of novel machines began to appear. Richter watched as amphibious trucks, the DUKWs, seemingly drove directly from the ocean onto the beach. He observed tanks lumbering ashore, some equipped with massive flails designed to detonate mines. These were Hobart's Funnies, specialized armored vehicles developed by the British to overcome precisely these types of defensive obstacles. The Germans possessed nothing comparable. The scene unfolding on the beach below transformed from a desperate struggle into a methodical process of annihilation. German strongpoints were systematically blinded and obliterated by naval gunfire, tank rounds, and aerial bombardment. On Omaha Beach alone, estimates suggest the 352nd Division would sustain approximately 1,200 casualties that day. A staggering percentage of its fighting force effectively wiped out within a matter of hours. Richter's own battery now constituted a primary target. Shells landed ever closer. A direct hit on one of the gun emplacements sent a fireball soaring into the air. Another gun was rendered inoperable. His telephone lines went dead. He was isolated. His command structure lay shattered. He looked up at the sky one final time. It presented a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the initial wave of landing craft was being supplanted by a second and then a third. Beyond them, the vast Armada patiently waited. It was a relentless conveyor belt of personnel and materiel that seemed impossibly to run on forever. The Allies would land approximately 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. The battle for the beaches was still raging with ferocious intensity, but the ultimate outcome had already been irrevocably determined. It was merely a question of time and sheer volume. The conflict in Normandy would continue for another 2 grueling months. The fighting within the hedgerows would prove brutal and costly, but it would ultimately change nothing. Every German tank destroyed represented a loss that could not be replenished. Every Allied tank lost was replaced by 3 more. Every German soldier who fell left an unfillable void in the defensive line. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that initial day, the remainder of the war was merely an epilogue. They fought on, driven by a sense of duty, by fear, or by a patriotism utterly divorced from reality. But the hope of victory had been extinguished. It had vanished with the dawning light of June 6th. We often envision the demise of the Third Reich as a slow, agonizing disintegration culminating in the climactic battle for Berlin. However, for the men stationed along the Atlantic Wall, the end arrived in a single, horrifying moment of revelation. It was the instant they beheld a fleet that stretched to fill the horizon, a sky blackened by enemy aircraft, and a force that was not merely an army, but the full crushing weight of the modern industrial world. It signaled the advent of a new form of warfare, one not waged in the hearts of soldiers, but orchestrated on the assembly lines of factories located thousands of miles away. And for one German officer peering through his binoculars at a sea transformed into steel, it was the morning he knew it was over.